Welcome to Season 3, Episode 11 of the Voicebox. Today is February 21st, and today is also President's Day, which is why in this episode, staff writer Nichelle will be interviewing beloved history teacher Mr. V about his personal favorite presidents, as well as his least favorite ones. Then, Nichelle will also be discussing what we should keep in mind when judging presidents from a historical perspective. Stay tuned till the end, and hope you enjoy.
Remember 8th grade U.S. history? Memorize the first 7 presidents and list some of their accomplishments. At a young age, we're often taught that there are a handful of great presidents, a handful of not-so-great presidents, and the rest are all forgettable. But that's not always the case. I'm Nichelle Wong, staff writer for the IHS Voice, and in honor of President's Day on Monday, I'll be interviewing Mr. V about presidents as well as sharing my own thoughts on them. Stay tuned to hear him explain why JFK is his favorite president and why Barack Obama is his least. Thank you so much for letting me interview you today. So first of all, who is your favorite American president and why?
All right. Well, when you're talking about presidents, favorite doesn't necessarily mean best. So I want to say that straight off the bat. Yeah. My favorite is not the best president, but I've got to go with JFK. It's a half personal and it's half just business. Let's talk personal. He's got a great confidence. We're reasonably sure that he dated Marilyn Monroe at one point. That's pretty impressive. Yeah. But on a business level, he also saved the world. With the Cuban Missile Crisis, we were looking at really having nuclear annihilation between the US and the USSR and all of their different allies getting involved. And JFK, like a boss, went behind the backs of his military leadership to arrange a way to talk freely and openly with the premier of the USSR, a guy named Khrushchev. And Khrushchev, also went behind the back of his military leadership to work something out in this negotiation that really brought the world away from the brink. Like, it's hard for Irvington kids these days to appreciate, because notably the world didn't end, just how close we came. But it's true. Like, it could have been the end of our species. And JFK was a major contributor to the fact that you and I are still here to talk about it. He wasn't a perfect president. He made a lot of mistakes, but that was one thing I think that we kind of all collectively owe him.
Oh, wow. So like the Cuban Missile Crisis. So could you give like just a brief summary about what that was?
Cuban Missile Crisis came up when the USSR tried to secretly put nuclear weapons on the islands of Cuba, specifically because Cuba is so close to us. Having those nukes there would allow them to strike the U.S. very quickly, and with the Americans having really minimal warning. And so that was very dangerous for us. Unfortunately for the Soviets, but good news for you and I, the Americans noticed that they were doing this, and they kind of set up a blockade to prevent the Soviets from bringing anything else. There was a question over whether or not the Soviets would try to break through that blockade. And if that led to a military exchange between the Americans and the Soviets, then maybe nukes would have been launched. But luckily, JFK and Khrushchev negotiated a kind of a backing away, a kind of like lessening of tensions before we got to that point. And it actually really worked out for the US, because we actually offered to give something up to the Soviet Union in exchange for them removing their nukes from Cuba. But unbeknownst to the Soviets, we were going to give up the stuff that we offered them anyway, regardless of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that stuff wasn't even announced. So to the world, it looked like the US had just like called the Soviet Union's bluff, and really came out looking much more prestigious as a result. And JFK in particular, even though it was more nuanced than that. And that's, to be perfectly honest with you, that's all of history. There's a cool story, and then there's all the boring and less exciting nuance behind it.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned that even though he's not technically the best president, he's your favorite president because of the impact he had. So I'm just wondering, what do you think about him, that like any character flaws or any beliefs that we might find incorrect today?
Ooh, that's a fun question. I like that. So, and this is kind of a bigger question about studying history in general. Like, to what standard do you hold a historical figure? To our present standard or the standard of the time. By the standard of their time, JFK was pretty progressive in regards to racial politics and was working toward desegregation before his assassination. But by our standards, he didn't do nearly enough and helped to kind of, I wouldn't say help, that's the wrong word. Let me backtrack on that. He didn't push hard enough to desegregate and bring a greater level of racial equality because of political factors. Mm-hmm. He allowed his concern for approval ratings and for trying to negotiate with southern states to get legislation that he wanted to cross. He didn't fight aggressively enough for fear that it might hold back his other policies, which is shameful, really, when you think about it. It's a little too unprincipled. But again, relative to many other politicians of the time, he did a great deal more than most. And after he's assassinated, his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, who will then become the president, will be the one that actually does push through voting rights laws and desegregation and things of that nature.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Like in 1965, I believe, was it?
Sorry?
Was like there was an act in 1965 or?
Yeah, in the mid 60s. I'm embarrassed to say I don't remember the specific year off the top of my head.
And do you have any anecdotes or interesting stories about JFK? Just like
how school appropriate do these need to be?
Mildly, I guess PG-13 level.
PG-13 level. Okay, I got you on that. So I think there's a pretty famous story about him getting high in the White House. And the story goes that he was high and was talking with people in the White House like, hey, wouldn't it be crazy if there was a nuclear war right now? And that's one of those things where it's like, that's funny because there wasn't a nuclear war, but had there been one, that might have been a little bit more problematic. There's also, and this is a fun, let me bring in some other Irvington teachers. Perhaps the most famous story about JFK that everybody knows beyond like the Cuban Missile Crisis is that after the Berlin Wall went up in the early 60s, he went and spoke to the German people in West Berlin and was speaking to them saying that like the US would continue to support West Berlin, even though this wall had been built around it. The city was literally in the middle of a severe communist state. And he, at the end of his speech, said something to the effect of like, I can say with pride, Ich bin ein Berliner. And the story goes that he said accidentally, because he used the wrong pronoun, that I'm a jelly donut. Because a Berliner is this type of pastry in Berlin. It's like a jelly donut. But it turns out, I learned with interest because Ms. Marcella Jensen and Ms. Bueller just recently went on a trip to Berlin. That story isn't quite true. He did say that, but nobody was confused about what he meant. They like to the people that were like in Berlin, they knew exactly what he was talking about because Ms. MJ tells me the people in Berlin didn't refer to the donuts that way. It was only people outside of Berlin that called them Berliners. And so this whole story that I have actually, to my discredit, told in my classroom for years is not entirely true. So there's an anecdote for you that is both a school one and a JFK one.
That's so interesting because it's so interesting how history works out. Like our perception of history versus how it actually happened. And even now, we might not even know what completely happened.
Right.
Good. All right. So now moving on, who's your least favorite president and why? Again, same questions about historical context.
Yeah, that's a tough one because there's so many kind of like disappointing presidents. So I'm going to take this in a different, right? Like I don't know if you're aware of this, and your listeners, I would love them to know. On a every 4 years basis, you actually have major historians and political scientists from across the country fulfill a very official kind of survey where they rank the presidents based on very serious criteria. And I can share the link with you after we're done talking if you want to like make that a part of the description for the podcast. And so there's all kinds of criteria to judge who the worst presidents are. And it tends to be the kinds of people who died very early in office or had lots of corruption or just were really ineffectual. All that to say, though, that those were kind of cliched. I would say that a really interesting president that I am very disappointed in, and this might surprise a lot of people, is Barack Obama. And I want to make it very clear, I'm not saying he's our worst president. And I'll even go on record saying that I voted for him both times. But what you had there in that presidency is a fantastic example of good intentions with very limited results. And some of those limitations on what the Obama administration achieved were outside of his control. The opposing party did everything they could to obstruct his efforts. And there's a lot that was just going on around the world where he was given no win options for how to deal with things. But it's worth noting that I think part of what makes me feel so disappointed in him is that there's this perception, especially in places like California, that he was this really tremendous leader. And he wasn't. He was a really tremendous person, and I still respect him deeply. But his failure in perpetuating what was going on in Afghanistan and misleading the American public about our progress there, his inability, not entirely of his own fault, but still nonetheless, as a leader of the country, to find some more compromise with the opposing political party in order to achieve his goals and leave quantifiable progress, I think are really detrimental. And it's also worth noting that a lot of people think of him as being very socially progressive, but relative to the average Irvington student, he wasn't in his presidency. He was actually pretty moderate and even less progressive than his vice president, current president, Joe Biden. And so I think that we were so rightfully excited to have someone who was this really compassionate, really smart, really well-spoken leader come into office, and also to celebrate America's first African-American president, which is a tremendous milestone for our country. But that excitement around the idea of Obama doesn't quite match up with the reality of his administration.
Yeah, that's a really interesting answer. And I've only heard that a few times. But I know that some people have said, for instance, he was like a good president who had good morals and good intentions, but his actions weren't necessarily as effective. So that's a few of the things I've heard about him. And so that also brings me to the question, how do you think we should judge presidents as, for example, good or bad? Should we judge them based on the impact they've had on the world, or should we judge them on how much, what they were like as a person, their character? Or is there any other factors that you would think?
It's a artificial choice, right? We should be judging them based on all of those things. In terms of what you want to prioritize, I definitely think, especially if you're looking at this from a historical standpoint, judging them based on their lasting, tangible legacies, either domestically or internationally, is in fact more important than who they were as a person. And a great example of that is Barack Obama, who is an exceedingly upstanding person and a very, in terms of a moral model, an excellent person. But in terms of his actual legacy as a president, it's not quite so rosy in that regard. We also talked a little bit about JFK, right? And relative to the time, one would call him progressive. Relative to today, one might even call him regressive by our modern standards, but you can't necessarily hold him to progress that didn't exist at his time.
That's true.
I think the most important thing to remember for anybody who's looking at presidents of the past is understanding that every single person is flawed, and that being objective means understanding that even a flawed person can have successes. And even a successful person can have unsavory attributes to themselves. But rather conveniently, I do think there's a pretty good overlap. Not a perfect, but a good overlap between the types of American presidents who are very good people and good presidents. And there aren't, in my subjective opinion, a lot of presidents who were really, really good presidents, but terrible people, or just wonderful human beings and abject trash as leaders of state. Usually it's somewhere closer to the middle.
Yeah, I definitely agree that there's an overlap. But one of the things that I really enjoyed about learning history, especially like because I took AP US history last year, is I learned a lot about the nuances in, like, as you said, in the presidents, because even if they were mostly good and the good presidents mostly had good characters, they all had flaws in some way, or based on our time period at least. And so that really opened my eyes. So do you think that, for example, in elementary and junior high, we should be teaching these nuances to students? Because I remember when I was a kid, I personally thought like the good presidents, like the founders, for instance, they were all good. And then there were some really bad presidents and like no in between.
Ooh, that's a very timely topic because there's a lot of discussion. And in fact, there's no way you could have known this, but I literally just finished doing like a Socratic seminar exam with my students,
Wow.
talking about this exact thing in regards to nationalism and what should textbooks teach. I will say only that any education that is truly aimed at building model citizens and giving a true understanding of the world will express successes and failures in history, honestly. But I think that there is room to create narratives about overall successes or overall failures. A good example of this is the United States in the Second World War. In that conflict, the United States was objectively and in an unqualified way on the side of right. They were the quote unquote good guys in that war. Now, the United States did some pretty shady things during that war. We put American citizens who happened to be Japanese in concentration camps, and we bombed German civilian centers in Nazi Germany. And we abandoned our allies in the Philippines pretty ungraciously. Like, America was not perfect. And you have to describe those things to understand how we might not just do better next time, but understand what was the mentality behind those decisions. Why would the side of right make those choices that are objectively poor, in order to understand ourselves and to understand how to address these things in future? But you can tell those stories without losing sight that the United States defeated in a very big way, not on its own, but like took one of the most important leading roles, in defeating Nazi Germany and fascist Italy and Imperial Japan. And that's for the good of the world.
That's a really good way to look at it, I suppose. Like, because I don't know, what you said just gave me chills because of how like impactful, and that's just an interesting mindset to have. And all right, thank you so much for this interview, and I'll be ending the recording here. From talking to Mr. V, I definitely learned a lot more about each of these presidents and the historical context behind their decisions. It's really interesting to consider all the different factors that come into play when judging a president, and it ties into the human condition as well. How do we evaluate if a person is truly good or bad? Even supposedly good people like Gandhi or Mother Teresa did things that we could consider bad today, to say nothing of presidents who have to balance politics and morality. For me personally, I decided on my favorites and least favorites through stories and personal connections to them, or just the personal feeling I got from hearing about them. Mr. Martinez, who some of you seniors might remember as the A-Push and We the People teacher last year, taught me a lot about the different presidents, and most of my information comes from the A-Push notes I took last year in his class, and my favorite president is also his favorite president. So Theodore Roosevelt was never supposed to be president, technically, because as a progressive in the Republican Party in the early 1900s, the party leaders found him a nuisance. They stuck him in the position of vice president to be rid of him so he would have a political office but not actually have any power. Yet President McKinley, who was the president before him, died in office, paving the way for Roosevelt. But even before then, he had a fascinating life. We think today that he had some form of mental health disorder like Asperger's. So on Valentine's Day, he actually lost his mother and wife on the same day, and that led him to go west and become a cattle rancher. Then later, when he became president, he spread his progressive ideas through the use of the bully pulpit, for example, like the use of presidential communication to speak to mass media and influence Congress. And for him, that was newspapers. And that was because when he went west, newspapers followed him around because they found him really interesting and they took photos of him. So he knew a little bit about how they could influence people. And that's also the time when his famous nickname came into play for Teddy. I won't go into that story because a lot of people know about it. And I'm going to talk about some less common stories. So as a progressive, Theodore Roosevelt championed ideas like government regulation for businesses and attacking issues like child labor and dangerous living conditions as part of his Square Deal. And these are definitely very progressive for his time period because at that time, people believed in pure capitalism and didn't want interference. Also, later on, after Roosevelt's second term, he pledged that he wouldn't run a third. However, his successor, President Taft, did such a terrible job that he decided to come back and run again. So he formed his own party called the Bull Moose President, even though he was really old, because as he said, I'm as healthy as a bull moose. Then, when he was giving a speech during his campaign trail, he was shot by a bullet in an assassination attempt. Luckily, he was improvising that speech. So he had stuck his speech into his coat pocket, and his spectacle case was also there. So when the bullet hit him, it was slowed down significantly and it didn't hurt him like severely enough to kill him. So he was able to survive that assassination attempt. Unfortunately, that derailed his campaign, so he wasn't able to win the third term. But also, despite his achievements and his ahead of his time thinking and progressivism, he did have flaws, which ties into how presidents are nuanced, as we discussed earlier. He was an imperialist who believed in the idea of there being civilized and uncivilized nations, and he thought of the United States as a dominant power that should conquer other uncivilized countries. So based on the time period, this is partly to maintain the U.S. strength in the Pacific, as he saw that Japan was a rising power and he was worried about them having control. It was also partly to strengthen the U.S. economy, and it was partly because of his own racist beliefs about civilization. Additionally, President Roosevelt was very war-hungry, and he often took or encouraged attacks based on the pretense of some situation. For example, a Spanish ambassador criticized President McKinley in a letter, and it was leaked to the public. Even though Roosevelt himself didn't like President McKinley and once called him weak, having the backbone of a chocolate eclair, he was incensed by the letter, or that's what he said anyways. Then, a little later, newspapers claimed that a U.S. ship called the Maine was blown up by the Spanish, despite a lack of evidence. Like, it was literally just a problem with the engines, probably. But that proved them enough incentive to go to war. Like, Theodore Roosevelt took that as, like, the pretense for them going to war. And he was clearly a nuanced president. He's not fully good or bad, even though he is one of my favorite presidents. And I think that for his time, for his progressivism, he was the best out of all of them. A lot of the presidents have a lot of flaws and positives. And I think that Roosevelt, like out of them, he was the best balance. But Andrew Jackson, on the other hand, created years of unstable banking in the United States and had many other negative effects, which is why he's my least favorite president. So for the banking issue, that was called the Bank War, which was fought against the central U.S. bank president named Nicholas Biddle. So at the time, well, even now, there's called the Central Bank of the United States, which is run by the federal government, and there are also state banks. So the Democrats, which is the party that Andrew Jackson belongs to, didn't trust the central banks, and they thought like state banks were better. Otherwise, like concentrated power is dangerous. And so the Second Bank of the United States had a charter to be continuing on to help the American people. And Andrew Jackson didn't want that to happen. So he wanted the charter to expire. So Biddle obviously didn't want his banks to expire. So he tried to contract credit to create a recession by like calling in loans and stuff. But that backfired on him and made people distrust the banks more. So then Jackson vetoed the charter to continue the second bank and then just allowed the original charter to expire. So then the bank wasn't able to continue, and that caused unstable banking for years until like the 1900s or something, for a really long time. But ironically, even though Jackson was the bank killer, he's on our $20 bill, which, among other reasons, is one why people are considering Harriet Tubman to be placed there instead. In fact, Jackson used his veto power a lot, and he went against the actions of Congress to make his own decisions. He also ignored the Supreme Court's decision that Native Americans had right to the land. So he signed this thing called the Indian Removal Act as well, which basically forced a lot of tribes off their land. It's like in exchange for us getting your land, you go move somewhere else. And that led to things like the Trail of Tears and further actions. However, despite all his negatives, he did have some positive impacts, which again ties back to how presidents aren't fully good or fully bad, because he was a war hero in the War of 1812, which is what led to his popularity in the first place. And so he was greatly liked by Americans because of his actions. And he captured Florida as well. He was the first populist president, which is when like a group of small grassroots voters, they claim that they represent the people, and then they vote and they actually win against what they consider the elite. And then the year that Jackson took office in 1828, poor white men were enfranchised, which means that they were allowed to vote. And then by the 1850s, there was universal white male suffrage due to his actions because he was a populist president of the people. And so he did have positive impacts on voting rights as well. And we could say that that could have been the basis of further suffrage later on. Popular perception of presidents is often that they're heroes or villains or irrelevant. However, it's clear that that's definitely not the case based on all the examples I've listed and the many more throughout history. As we celebrate President's Day this year, we should consider both their positive and negative impacts, and remember that how under everything, under all the politics and morality and all these questions, we are all multifaceted humans because we could be the future president someday too. Thank you very much for listening, everybody.